Everyone, and welcome to Patient Empowerment Network and our Path to Empowerment Living with Multiple Myeloma series. For this program, we'll be talking about clinical trials. I don't have any experience with clinical trials, but we have two incredible patient panelists who will be talking about their experiences with clinical trials. My name is Lisa. I'm the empowerment lead for PEN. I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma back in April of 2018, so I'm going on 5 years now of having myeloma. All of my blood work looked fine. I was actually diagnosed with a large plasmacytoma, so I had radiation, surgery to stabilize my spine, and then induction therapy of KRD for 6 months. I have kappa light chain myeloma, so no M spike. Doing relatively well after my 6 months of induction. I went on maintenance therapy. I was on Revlimid for 4 years straight, and have since gone off of that with the blessing of the two specialists I've talked with. So I'm currently on no therapy other than the therapies that help with side effects. And I'm doing relatively well. I do have minimal residual disease at 10 to the -6. And so I am just being closely monitored to see when that might shift. And I need to go on a different therapy. So we do have two patient panelists here. I'm really excited. I've met both of them through patient advocacy events. Jack and Thomas are here today to talk about their experiences. I do have to say, two things about Jack and Thomas. They both are support group leaders for the International Myeloma Foundation support groups. I appreciate those so much. We have one locally. If you don't belong to one, I highly recommend looking into a support group for myeloma. Very beneficial. So I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves. How about if we start with Jack first and just talk about when you were diagnosed in your myeloma journey and where you're at now, and then we can move on to Thomas. Go ahead, Jack.
Thomas and Lisa, great to see you again. I was diagnosed in early 1995, so that's more than 28 years ago. And there weren't many treatments available back then, but I was fairly aggressive. I was young at 45. And my initial treatment after a chemo induction was a tandem autologous transplant. So that's a transplant using your own stem cells. And I was given two of them about 3 months apart from one another. That was in 95, but unfortunately, even though I got into a remission, that remission only lasted for 1.5 years. So at the end of 97 or so, I went into my first clinical trial, and that was for the drug called thalidomide. I was one of the first 70 patients in that trial. And while that was a really important trial, in part because 1/3 of the patients responded to it, I didn't respond at all. I was on the trial for 3 months, and my myeloma got worse as I was on thalidomide. So I tried other chemo regimens in 98, but had nothing else but one last treatment option for me, and that was a full allogeneic transplant. An allo is where you get your stem cells from a donor. So like all transplants, it began with a high dose of chemotherapy, and then I got stem cells from one of my sisters who was my donor. That was a very difficult transplant. It, for me, required 5 weeks in the hospital and a couple more weeks as an outpatient. It caused something called graft versus host disease for a couple of years. It caused some plasmacytomas, some tumors of myeloma cells that had to be radiated over the next couple of years. But since 2002, I've been in a great remission and have not been on any treatment. So I will stop there. I was involved in one other trial for neuropathy as a side effect from thalidomide, but I can talk about that later.
Thank you, Jack. Thomas?
Thanks for having me first. I too was diagnosed at a very young age of 34 years old. I underwent a stem cell transplant using my own cells, which did not take. A few months later, I started a clinical trial plus another stem cell transplant, but this time it was with an outside donor, allogenic transplant, with my brother as my donor. Again, I did make complete remission from that. I like to use the word response. I did make complete response from that. However, a year later, that did not last long, and I underwent a third stem cell transplant. This time, another clinical trial using my brother as my donor. I went on a not a monoclonal antibody. Let's start that over. I went on a modulatory medication for about 8 years. And when COVID happened, I relapsed once again. I was placed on a monoclonal antibody. I was on that one for another year and a half, and I'm currently on a different monoclonal antibody, which is I'm stable. Everything looks good, and I'm happy to be where I'm at right now.
Awesome. And before we start into our questioning, I just want to put a disclaimer out there that this program is solely based off of our own patient experiences and should not be substituted for medical advice. If you have any questions about your medical condition, please seek out a consultation from your own medical providers. Also, if you have any questions at all for our patient panelists, please use the chat box or the Q&A function on Zoom. We have a producer behind the scenes who'll be monitoring these questions so the patient panelists can answer those questions at the end of the program. So stay tuned. So I think we'll jump right into some of the questions. And these questions that we're going to talk about are either questions that I've had myself or that I've heard from other patients who are interested in clinical trials, but usually have not been through clinical trials. So I think I'm going to ask this question of both of you because it's interesting to me how people hear about clinical trials. So starting with Thomas, how did you hear about the trial in which you participated? And did you have any reservations when it was mentioned to you? Or were you nervous about it and why?
The first clinical trial that I participated in, my doctor presented it to me. And she said that, being that you're still young, and finally, I had a outside donor because prior to that, for the bone marrow registry, I did not have one because it was tested first. Then they tested my family, and they said, since you have one within your family, we're going to, consider allogenic transplant using one of them as your donors. And luckily, my oldest brother was the only one out of 7 biological siblings, 8. Including myself. So when she presented it to me, and being young, I was in a live life phase, so she could have told me anything about the clinical trial, and I wanted to overcome the odds that was given to me that 3 to 5 years is most common for newly diagnosed patients. So once I received that information from her, I was very intuitive about learning about it. Because I wanted to defeat the odds, most importantly. And I really didn't get into much of the trial itself. So I didn't have reservations because I wanted to be that patient to help others.
Okay, good to know. So was the provider who told you about it, was he or she a myeloma specialist, or was it, did you see a specialist right away?
Yes.
Okay.
As soon as I went to the bone marrow transplant unit, that was a myeloma specialist that was there. So I've been seeing her ever since I've had myeloma.
Okay, that's good to know. A lot of people.
After my initial oncologist visit. So after I did my induction with him, he sent me to her.
That's great. Okay, that's something that I think a lot of patients experience. They see a local oncologist and don't have myeloma specialists in the area. A big push on our program, and I think a lot of patient advocates, we encourage people to seek out a myeloma specialist, even if it's just for one consult or via Zoom. So thanks for that, Thomas. And Jack, how about you? How did you hear about your trial or trials that you participated in?
First one was the thalidomide trial, and it was my oncologist that suggested the trial since I didn't have much else available in 97, at the end of 97. And I had heard of thalidomide. Others may have too, because it was a drug that was used in the 50s, primarily in Europe. It was never approved in the US. Primarily in Europe for pregnant ladies that it would help deal with the nausea and such. But you may also recognize that it caused something called thalidomide babies, which were born with deformed extremities. So, so it hadn't been in use in many, many years until this trial for myeloma. And it was my doctor that suggested it. He showed me the consent form that all trial patients should read carefully. And that's how I found out about that one. The second trial was for neuropathy, which I think I located myself through clinicaltrials.gov, just checking things out because I could tell this neuropathy as a result of the thalidomide was getting worse at the time. So I found that, and I could get it locally, and I did. It also didn't work. But I'm all for doing trials because that's how we advance the treatment for myeloma.
So Jack, you mentioned that it didn't work, and that was a question that's come up sometimes too. If it seems like something isn't working, do you stop the trial? Do you stop participation, or do you just see it through for the full amount of time, like 2 years or whatever that time might be?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lisa. So first of all, patients will see in that consent form, to my knowledge, every consent form I've ever read through, which are a lot of them. The patient has the ability to stop the trial at any time. Doesn't have to give a reason, they can always stop. For the thalidomide trial, since my myeloma was getting worse after 3 months on the trial, both the doctor and I said we should stop and try something else. And for the neuropathy trial, I believe I went through it also for about 3 or 4 months, and we found no improvement, so that was stopped.
Okay. And while in the trials, were you still followed by your regular oncologist, or was your regular oncologist the person doing the trials anyway?
Two different things. In the first, the thalidomide trial, he was my regular oncologist. So I was followed by him. In the neuropathy trial, it was a different oncologist. So I would still connect with my local oncologist as well as be in that trial.
Okay. Thomas, were you followed by your regular local oncologist, or was it the specialist who was doing the trial?
It was a specialist because it was right after my stem cell transplant, using my autologous stem cell transplant. And she's the one that realized that through lab work that it didn't take.
Okay.
So for my next treatment plan, she said, okay, we're going to provide you with this particular clinical trial. And then we're going to bring your brother in as a donor, as a donor.
So do you think, is it pretty typical, because I lived in an area where we don't have specialists. I'm sure there are a lot of people with myeloma who don't have specialists. If a person were to participate in a clinical trial, I'll ask you this question, Thomas, and they want to keep their local oncologist on board, do they need to communicate? Say, for example, somebody from my area, which is Boise, Idaho, goes to the Huntsman Cancer Institute in Salt Lake, which is the closest place, and they're seeing a specialist. The investigator for that trial is following them. Can they still see their local oncologist back in their hometown? Is that pretty typical? Could they request that, or how might that work for a patient? Or do you think they would just follow specialists?
They could probably see the patient, but that oncologist wouldn't have any correlation with the clinical trial.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just wondering if they would have any need to even see their local oncologist during a trial. I know for me, I love my local oncologist, so I want him to be aware of everything that was going on. So, okay, thanks for that. So, and then Jack, have you ever been part of a trial, either one of your trials? I guess you talked about that a little bit. So I'll give you a fake scenario. If somebody wants to switch arms of the trial, say, for example, there's a trial where somebody wants to have a stem cell transplant, they're investigating stem cell transplant versus no stem cell transplant. Maybe I joined that trial. I want to have the stem cell transplant. That's why I joined it, but I didn't get picked for that. And that's kind of hard to blind. You can't, that can't be a blinded study because if you get the transplant or not. Is it possible for people to say, I want to be on the other arm? Can we switch this around a little bit? Can people do that with clinical trials?
Well, it depends on the trial itself. in both my cases, I was on an earlier phase trial where there wasn't any control arm, as you're referring to, a non-transplant arm in your case. But in phase 3 trials, there are typically at least 2 arms, one being a control arm, and your hypothesis is that you might rather be on the new drug arm rather than the standard of care arm, the control arm. If many trials have it written into the trial that if a patient is on the control or standard of care arm and they progress, their disease gets worse, they're allowed to cross over to the other arm. You can't do it up front. You can't say, I've been randomized to this control arm. Nah, I don't want that. I want the other arm. You can't do that. You can not be in the trial, but in general, you can't do that at the beginning. But if, and that's important to read again in the consent form, if there is crossover, it does give you that opportunity should the standard of care arm not work so well.
Okay. I think some patients have that question because some patients join a trial because they want to be on the experimental arm. And you mentioned a really good point about standard of care. When people join clinical trials, they will, for myeloma, they will never be given nothing. They'll always be given the standard of care and then the experimental arm. So a patient won't be without some kind of treatment during a clinical trial. Is that correct?
Mostly, unless the standard of care is to give nothing.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then let's see, Jack, I do have one more question for you. So with the newer trials, I know you're a researcher and you know a lot about these clinical trials. So with a lot of the trials that are happening now with novel therapies, there are subsequent phases of those where some therapies are being brought forward to earlier lines of therapy or even frontline therapy. So for a patient who is given, say, for example, they're diagnosed with myeloma, they're given the standard of care or a clinical trial. There's a lot of, I think, reluctance to join a clinical trial because novel therapies are so effective, so they could just get the standard of care. Do you have any suggestions? And I'll ask the same question of Thomas. Suggestions for a patient who is realizing, okay, standard of care is really good, clinical trial might be better, it's my first treatment or maybe second treatment. Do you have any suggestions for how a patient might think about that and decide what is best for them?
Well, my opinion is that the benefit of going on to a trial is that you are watched very carefully. You may need to take more labs than the average patient. You may need to be seen by the doctor more often than the average patient. But the benefit to you being on that trial is someone is watching you carefully to see what the results are in the trial, whether you're on the standard of care treatment or the new drug treatment, new therapy treatment. If it's not too inconvenient with respect to patient burden or travel or things like that, then I always think there's a benefit to the patient for being on a clinical trial.
So Thomas, can you explain how a trial with an allo transplant works? Is there a control arm and an experimental arm? And then also, how long do they follow you after that trial to see if it was effective?
Yes, it is a standard of care arm. Like Jack said, it's a standard of care arm. And when I was on it post auto transplant, I didn't know it was randomized, so I didn't know what arm I was going to be put on. But I do think that I was on the arm with the experimental drug on it, as we may say. So, and I'm not sure how long I was followed. I just know that after 1 year of being on after that transplant, 2 years really. So I did make complete response. So after 2 years of being on that first clinical trial, that it failed. I relapsed. And my next option was another clinical trial and another transplant.
Okay. So when the time is done, when they say this trial is for 2 years, is there ever any continued data collected? Did you ever have any continued data collected from that trial? Both you, Thomas, and also Jack, I'm curious if when they say the trial is done, it's done, or if they send out questionnaires or surveys just to ask any follow-up questions about how you're doing, even though the trial is done. Did you ever have any follow-up beyond the date of the end date of the trial, Thomas?
Not the first one. I don't recall either, because they both failed after 1 year.
Okay.
And then I was, well, after 2 years for the first, 1 year for the second. So after the second trial, I was placed on immunotherapy as my treatment. And I don't think none of my labs was followed up for the clinical.
Okay. And how about you, Jack? Did you ever have any subsequent follow-up at the end of the trial date? Even when they're failed, do they ever collect information like on side effects or?
Yeah, that's a good question. Neither of my trials involved any follow-up. It was an issue, did you respond or not respond? And that was that. But there are trials that do follow up. They will follow up, let's say 6 months, 12 months, 2 years after a trial, for example, to see if you are still MRD negative, if you were MRD negative at the end of the trial. They may follow up with what are called PROs, patient-reported outcomes, to see how you are feeling a year later after the trial has ended, so that the patient would fill out this information and they would collect the information. So there are trials that have follow-up, but neither of the ones that I did had any follow-up.
Okay. And then one more question I have about that. I don't know, a patient had asked this question. If you suspect that you had any kind of side effects from something that was done on a clinical trial has closed, is there a way to report those, or are you ever given information on how to report those back to the investigator or to someone, so they know that maybe the side effect was a result of a specific drug?
Yeah, in fact, it's a requirement of any trial that it'll be your doctor that, for example, recognizes, or you've told that you have this side effect, and it's a requirement that that be reported back to the pharma company or the organization that put together that trial.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
And,
that.
And to clarify, I want to say that in my trial, it was a standard of care and or a placebo plus the medication that they was offering. So I don't want to confuse it with two different arms. I just want to let you know it was standard of care or it was the medication that they was giving me.
And I might have misunderstood too, Thomas. Was the allo transplant you had, was that just a treatment that was given, or was that part of a trial? Were they looking?
It was part of a trial.
Okay.
It was part of a trial, where you take the desired medication that they was testing, and then the melphalan stem cell transplant. Okay.
Great. Thanks for explaining that. So Thomas, do you have, other than your brother maybe saying you're smarter and better looking now that you have some of his cells in you, do you have any regrets about being on trials?
None whatsoever. And, he don't have a regret about donating to me as well. You know, he calls me 98 now, or I call him 98. Well, he says 98, meaning that I'm 98% him. So he loves it.
I bet he does.
And he said he's happy to do it again if he have to. So, and I told him he's on speed dial just in case.
Awesome. That's awesome. Good.
And no, I honestly don't regret being on the trial. Actually, now I'm more knowledgeable now about clinical trials than I was at the beginning. Because that was 2-3 transplants in less than 5 years for me. And it just hit me, you're young and you want to have the best quality and quantity of life, so once you understand the process and understand what you're doing and what you're going through, you know, then you start understanding more about it. And now that I'm tenured in myeloma, I like to use this for others, you know, for people to say, or people to hear, or people to see that, you know, especially in the African American communities, that somebody that looks like them has been in a clinical trial. And, you know, that goes a long way. And so I don't have any regrets about it, but now I'm more knowledgeable about it and I can explain it better than I could back then.
Mhm. Yeah, you're a great advocate for that. So remind me again, how many years out are you from diagnosis?
This year makes 18 years.
18 years. And 3
Yeah.
clinical trials total you've done?
Probably more than that. Two specifically for myeloma. I've done some for GVHD for my eyes. I guess that's caused by myeloma as well, and others as well. But those 3 are probably the main 3 clinical trials that I've been in.
Well, thanks for all that information and encouraging people to do that.
And the last thing, I can't boast about being a myeloma survivor for 18 years when I'm on Zoom with Jack, Jim, Yalak, you know.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I'm always going to be 10 years behind Jack, you know, so, but I accept it. I love it. I'm happy.
You can boast, Thomas, because you're 13 years ahead of me. So
Absolutely.
So Jack, do you have any regrets of any? I know you didn't do a transplant trial, but do you have any regrets about the trials you were on, other than maybe they didn't work for you, but any regrets trying?
No, I think, as I keep reiterating, trials are awfully important to advance the progress of treatment forward for myeloma patients. You know, since Thomas, for example, was diagnosed, which I guess is around 2005, we've probably had 14 or so new drugs, treatments approved for myeloma. And that's all been a result of other patients participating in trials. And now we've increased the length of survival for the average myeloma patients. When I was diagnosed, I was told I would have 2 to 3 years to survive whatever treatment I got. And these days, the doctor will tell a standard risk myeloma patient that they fully expect to see them in 10 years. So, I mean, that's all a result of trials. Can I mention one thing about donors and allos and such?
Yeah.
First of all, they hardly ever do an allo transplant anymore. So patients watching this shouldn't run into their doctor and say, hey, I saw someone with 28 years survival or 18 years survival and they got an allo transplant. Let's do it. Well, the problem is that full allo transplants still have about a 40 or 50% mortality rate. So I was very fortunate to have survived, and Thomas is very fortunate to have done well enough to go on to other treatments as well. And then you asked Thomas the question about how the donor felt about it. My sister was my donor. She felt great about it. What I think is interesting is they look for antigens to determine if your sibling matches or not. And there's a 1 out of 4 chance that a sibling matches. So Thomas to have 7 siblings and only 1 match is pretty rare. I only had 2 siblings and 1 match, so that was very fortunate. And one of those things that it doesn't matter if it matches or not is blood type. So I actually have a different blood type now than I was born with because I have my sister's blood type. I tell my sister I also have my monthly mood swings, but that's neither here nor there. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you.
Oh, that's great.
I did the same. I went from O positive to B positive. So
Yeah.
my blood type changed completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Huh?
You know, it is interesting, Jack. You mentioned a great point. Allo is not standard of care. Autologous transplant using your own stem cells is. I have met several people, though, who've had allo. So it's really intriguing to me to find to find those people and to see how they're doing. And particularly, like Thomas, you mentioned, I think Jackie did too, the graft versus host disease. That's something that's ongoing, something that maybe isn't talked about because allos aren't as common. So there might be a subpopulation who are possibly dealing with that, but you're right, it's not standard of care to have an allo transplant.
So in the early 2000s, there was research into a type of allo that was referred to as a mini allo transplant. And it basically did not begin with a high dose of chemotherapy as your normal auto or full allo would start with. Over the years, it was shown that they were really more effective, were not more effective than the standard autologous transplant. So you may, and I know people that have done well from the mini allo transplant. So you always have to kind of clarify what kind of allo did you get.
Yeah, that's interesting too.
And Jack and I have had this conversation before because he asked me that specific question, and I told him I've had all of them. I had the non-myeloablative auto, non-myeloablative allo, and the myeloablative allo. Basically meaning that with the myeloablative, I got the highest dosages of the medications.
Wow. Yeah. So Jack, I know we've talked about this before in previous programs, but I'm curious, you're pretty far out from your diagnosis. How often do you have your disease monitored as far as labs or scans or both or neither?
I still go in every 6 months for blood draws.
Okay.
And I see either my nurse practitioner who's been seeing me for 20 years or my hematologist oncologist who's been seeing me for about 10 years to meet with them and go over those blood counts and such.
Good. Yeah. And Thomas, you're on active treatment, so you probably get monitored more frequently with
every
labs.
2 weeks. Every
okay.
2 weeks. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, the last question I have for both of you is, people are learning more about clinical trials. A lot of patients, including myself, have some reluctance. I guess it's just a fear of the unknown. There's also some reluctance because patients may have to travel. There may be logistic problems. There may be financial concerns, maybe just fear. If you were to give a patient a couple of suggestions, Jack, they're being offered a clinical trial on how to really evaluate whether that's right for them, what would you say to those patients?
First, I'd make sure that the patient understands the particular phase of that clinical trial. For myeloma, there are, in most trials, there are 3 phases of clinical trials. The first one is really just looking at the new treatment and figuring out what the best dosage is and to make sure that it's safe to give humans. So typically phase 1 trials are trials where a treatment is being used for the first time in a human. The second phase then looks at whether or not that treatment has efficacy at that dosage that they found in the first phase. And the third phase looks at typically a control arm versus that new treatment arm to see if that new treatment is better than what already exists. So understand those phases and what's the phase of the trial you're going into. For example, it may not be advantageous to a patient to go into a phase 1. They may not even be getting whatever the ultimate standard dosage is because they typically start off with a lower dosage. Or, Lisa, you brought up the example earlier in a phase 3 trial, maybe the patient doesn't want to take a chance at being randomized into the standard of care arm. So just understand that. And then I guess I would say the other thing is read through the consent form, and it's probably 20 some odd pages, more carefully than you think you should, because it will talk about cost. For example, it has to have a paragraph about cost to the patient. It has to have a paragraph about known side effects of these new drugs. It has to have paragraphs on why we're doing this trial and what we expect to learn from it. So just become informed. And maybe the last thing is if you're going in a phase 2 or phase 3, if the results of earlier phase trials are available for that particular treatment, investigate and find out what happened.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Jack. And Thomas, any suggestions from you for patients who are considering clinical trials?
The only thing I would like to add from what Jack said is that I like to tell patients that clinical trials don't mean end of life. You know, you can be on a clinical trial without being on your last resort, you know, because that's the stigma that a lot of patients have about clinical trials, is that, oh, if I'm on a clinical trial, that means I'm about to die, or that means that, you know, it's not working. And that's far from the truth. You know, you can be on clinical trials just to test the medication, you know, just to get prepared to see how this works on you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Thomas. I was one of those people when I was first diagnosed. I was down at MD Anderson and there was a mention of clinical trials. And that was exactly my thought, is I will never be on a clinical trial because I'm not going to get to the point where it's just trying to salvage my life. You know, we're going to try to throw everything at you. So I think that that's a really important note to make, is clinical trials aren't just there to, you know, because it's the last ditch effort. That's not why all clinical trials were there. So thanks for that important point. And with that, we'll wrap this up and move on to the live Q&A with Dr. Manni. So thank you so much, Jack and Thomas, for being here. There may be questions coming through for the patient panelists. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you. And we'll move on to our live program.
Thank you again, Jack and Thomas. It was great to listen to some of those questions that we had from patients. We also have joining us right now from Huntsman Cancer Institute at University of Utah, I'm not sure if we say Dr. Manni or Dr. Manni. I had the pleasure of meeting you at a webinar back in the fall. Or not a webinar, but at a live conference. So that was great to meet with you. We encourage patients to use your Q&A function or your chat function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of any of the panelists. Again, this is live, so Dr. Manni is here to answer questions also. We do have some questions. I'm going to start off because I know a lot of clinical trials right now are happening with CAR T therapy. And one of the big, I think, areas of reluctance for patients to participate in those, we had a question from a patient who registered asking about some of the side effects. One of those is CRS, or cytokine release syndrome, and something called ICANS. I think it's immune effector, I can't remember, cell-associated neurotoxicity syndrome. So Dr. Manni, if you could just talk about those a little bit, because patients, I think, are afraid of those really serious side effects. What are those side effects with CAR T therapy, whether it's in clinical trials or regular treatment, and how are those being managed or mitigated for patients?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So
Thank you.
I always explain the CAR T toxicity as something that's a little bit more unpredictable. So a lot of the patients here might have heard about or been through a transplant. And with a transplant, the toxicities are more predictable, right? They follow a pattern where, you know, right after you get the chemo for the first day or two, you may feel fine, then the nausea worsens, then the blood counts drop, and you may get an infection, and things start getting better, right? 2 weeks into the transplant, things get better. It is usually predictable. The thing about CAR T is that it's a little bit more unpredictable. So during the initial phase, which is the first 2 weeks, the main things that we watch out for, well, one of them is called cytokine release syndrome, and that usually manifests as a fever. And sometimes it could be more than a fever. It could be that your blood pressure drops, or you need some oxygen, or you have really high-grade fevers and have a lot of inflammation. Usually with myeloma CAR Ts, this is something that subsides fairly quickly. So it will probably happen, but it'll subside quickly with the use of anti-inflammatory medications, a medication that's called tocilizumab or some steroids, usually subsides. And depending on what CAR T product you're getting, this could happen either 1 or 2 days after the infusion, or it could sometimes happen a week after the infusion. But usually it's something that will happen within the first 10 days of infusion. So that is called cytokine release syndrome. Then there's another thing that, for the purpose of simplicity, we'll just say neurotoxicity. So neurotoxicity means that those angry immune cells that we've infused, they can irritate the brain, and they can irritate the spinal cord, and they can enter the area, the cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. Now, this is something that usually is pretty rare. So it's much more common to have cytokine release syndrome. It is rarer to have this neurotoxicity. And this neurotoxicity, usually, it could be pretty subtle, right? So it could be that there's some subtle word finding difficulties, or your writing is not as good as you as it is, or you're just having trouble doing math. Like it could be subtle things. In its severe form, which we thankfully don't see often, especially with these myeloma products, it could lead to people being comatose. Like in the past with some lymphoma CAR-Ts, we've had people who were needed a breathing tube because they were just so comatose, so somnolent that they needed that support. But for the most part, that is it most often doesn't happen, and if it is, it's usually mild. Now, every CAR-T product is different, but this is something that we've observed throughout the myeloma CAR-T trials. Now, the side effects don't end there, unfortunately. So those are the common ones, right? So unlike transplant, this is not causing nausea, and it doesn't typically cause diarrhea, but it causes these side effects. And then it does, however, suppress the immune system, and it does lower the blood counts. And the thing about the blood count lowering is that it's unpredictable. So not everybody will have severe drop in their blood counts, but not everybody will have their blood counts rise up within 2 weeks either, right? So it could be 4 weeks, it could be 6 weeks. We've had occasions where the blood counts have stayed low for months. And obviously, we don't like it when the blood counts are low. It puts our patients at risk for infections. So that is one of the side effects that is unpredictable and can be a more lingering, persistent issue than the other two that we mentioned. Sometimes we've seen some bleeding. We obviously have seen some infection. With one of the CAR-T products called Cilta-cel or Carvykti, which is actually FDA approved, we've seen some odd neurological side effects. We've seen like Bell's palsy or some facial palsies. We've occasionally, very rarely, seen some Parkinsonian features, like people having tremors. Those things are rare, and they haven't really been seen very often with other CAR-T products. But obviously, on a clinical trial, you do obviously worry about some new side effect that hasn't previously been described. But as a class of drugs, I think those are the main side effects that we see with CAR-T.
Thank you for that. So are patients right now, is CAR-T always done inpatient, or can patients have that done outpatient, just monitored really closely?
Yeah, so mostly it is done inpatient, but there are some protocols that are looking at outpatient, and there are some programs that now are doing some of the FDA-approved CAR-Ts as an outpatient. So I do envision a future where we're more comfortable with these products and we do it mostly outpatient. As of right now, the odds are that it will probably be inpatient if you're enrolling on a trial.
Okay, thank you for that. And one more question about clinical trials is we had a registrant ask if there are any clinical trials for patients with smoldering myeloma that you can speak to that may be actively enrolling right now, if you know of any.
Good question. Yeah, there are quite a few actually. I think, so are you talking about CAR-T specifically, or are you talking about just trials in general for smoldering?
Yeah, I think this is just a general question for any general trials for smoldering
Absolutely.
myeloma. Yeah.
So the last I looked on clinicaltrials.gov, there are close to 30 active trials for smoldering myeloma, which it's a bit of a dicey topic, but a lot of these trials are small trials that are looking at drugs that are already approved in myeloma. So they've already shown efficacy and some level of safety in myeloma, and they're being used in smoldering myeloma. Again, this is a contentious topic, so I'll try not to get too much into the debate of this, but yes, there are trials.
Thank you for answering that. That kind of leads me to another topic, and that has to do with support groups. We have a couple of registrants asking about support groups. I learned a lot of my information to take back to my medical team, which I'll encourage everybody. This program does not substitute for medical advice. Always talk to your own medical team. But I do go to my local support group. We have a support group through the IMF, and they are wonderful. I ask patients, have you been through CAR-T? Have you been through this? So one of the panelists asked if they said they're in need of a local support group. Are there any available national or state registries? I think support groups in general. Jack, do you mind answering that question? If they're looking for one, maybe they don't have one in their area, where they might find a support group? Because I ask my support group members all kinds of questions.
Sure. One of the good sources for finding support groups is the International Myeloma Foundation, who has a listing of 150 support groups around the country. And more importantly, these days, most of the support groups are virtual. So I run a support group in the San Francisco Bay Area. You can always go to our website and ask to join our support group, even if you live in Thomas's area of Atlanta. So the support groups are very readily available, and it's important to, many of the support groups have experts like Dr. Manni present at the groups, as well as sharing experiences and learning what questions to ask your doctor also come out of joining these.
Thank you for that. And I do see a question live, and also we had a couple of registrants ask about the impact of age on clinical trials. So I'm wondering if Dr. Manni can speak to that a little bit, unless Jack was already answering that question. But if you can speak to that a little bit, is there an age, especially for CAR-T now, because that's where a lot of the trials are, is there an age limit?
So historically, there have been age limits that are fairly arbitrary and I would say unfair for clinical trials. This is changing. So there's ample data now from real world where older patients have received CAR-T, and we've observed similar outcomes in terms of efficacy and safety as opposed to younger participants. So it depends on the trial, but generally speaking, age should not be an exclusionary feature. And there are many trials out there that don't have like upper age limits, and you can get CAR-T on them.
Thank you. I'm kind of doing rapid fire questions here. I do have a question for Thomas. Thomas, I know that you have dexamethasone as part of your current treatment, and it's the drug that we love to hate. It seems to be super effective, can have awful side effects. So the question is, how do you counter any side effects that you have from Dex, especially on your coming down day?
Well, first of all, I come to realize that dexamethasone is beneficial even with all of the negative side effects that it has. Prime example, I was experiencing excruciating side effects from my monoclonal antibody. And I mentioned to my doctor exactly what was going on. And she said, oh, just take 2 Dex pills the day after. And I have not had those side effects since. However, I still have the crash and the cravings and everything else that comes with it. And the way that I deal with the Dex is I don't fight it. You know, you have insomnia from it, and you just sit here and try to close your eyes and go to bed, and you won't do anything but toss and turn all day and make it worse. So I don't fight it. I just let it wear off. I let it run its course, and that's it. Now in the kitchen, that's different. So you got to have some discipline, because you know with that steroid, it causes you to crave everything. It gives you an insulin spike, so it causes you to crave everything. So that's just something you have to deal with on your own, to fight those cravings or succumb to them. And I hope you don't succumb to them.
Thanks for that, Thomas. So we've had a couple of questions also live, and then from 2 registrants asking about any clinical trials that are adding maintenance therapy or continuous therapy following a CAR-T. Dr. Manni, can you speak to that a little bit, if you know if there are any, and what's being looked at with those, please?
Yes, absolutely. So, so just like with smoldering, there are a few small trials. So these aren't like large randomized trials, but there are a few small trials that are looking at using active myeloma drugs and seeing if we can prolong the response after CAR-T. So to the best of my knowledge, there was one on belantamab, and there was one on IMiDs, so Revlimid, that was presented. I think that was by the Pennsylvania group. So there aren't large registrational phase 3 studies looking at this concept, but there are small phase 1 studies that are looking at this and seeing if there's a signal that perhaps we can prolong the response further. So that is the basic summary of where we're at in terms of maintenance post CAR-T. I would personally think that the bar should be high, in that, at least in all the conversations that I've had with my patients, one of the best selling points for CAR-T and what really makes patients excited is that they finally get a long break from treatment. And I personally think that if we are to get rid of that break, it should be worth it. It should truly transform the disease and not lead to worse quality of life. So that's my bar for adopting maintenance after CAR T. And that's, at least a discussion that I've had with my patients, that's what they would want as well. But there are some early phase studies looking at this question. I really do hope that, we can continue to give our patients a long break from treatment, because there's something so cool about CAR T. And I hope that, if something is truly that good that it can be used as maintenance, well and good. But if it doesn't, then I think we're better off just giving people a nice long break lasting years from treatment.
That is nice, that fixed duration. I think that's what we all want. And I have a question for both Thomas and Jack about that a registrant, when they signed up, they asked this question, which I think is important. Dr. Manni touched on quality of life is very important. And sometimes with these side effects from continuous therapy, it can impact our quality of life. But the question from the registrant is, are there any emotional side effects to clinical trial participation? So Jack, do you mind touching on that first, if there were any emotional impacts that you can think of or that you had, and then Thomas, please.
Well, emotional impacts depends probably more on the individual than the trial, if you will, in my experience. So I think for me, it was always a question of, will it work? Will it work? Will it work? And that puts a stress on you, right? But you also see the trial as having the advantage of maybe getting the best treatment possible going forward that's not available yet. And so that's a positive impact. And you're watched, as I mentioned in the earlier replay, very carefully by the doctor. So I don't think I experienced personally emotional impacts, only a frustration when they didn't work for me, but I know how important they are to the myeloma community.
And
Thanks, Thomas.
And I agree with Jack. However, being diagnosed very young, it was emotional impact on me. The whole diagnosis was emotional impact. And then the fact that the first transplant failed and I was sent right into a second transplant, which was a clinical trial, it did provide emotional effect on me as well. But I went through that phase, the why me phase, then I went fast to why not me, and then just thought about the clinical trial as helping others. So if it failed for me, maybe it was something that it got me to the next one, and then this one gets me to the next one. And as long as I can help others, that was my outlook for being on a clinical trial.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'll also stress the importance again of a support group. I think the emotional impact can be maybe dampened a little bit by having the support of others. I mean, we walk into our support group sometimes and somebody just says, well, how was your day-to-day? Well, I'm having these side effects and it kind of just crap. So it's that emotional impact that you might be experiencing, whether it's from clinical trials or from treatment in general, having a support group and having a really strong medical team who's willing to listen to that and maybe address any mental health issues that might accompany that is super important. And Dr. Manni, that leads to another question, because I think one thing that does affect people emotionally is this notion of myeloma being incurable. So one of the registrants asked also, can you explain myeloma as it relates to myeloma, cure versus remission? And do you think that cure will be a word we'll hear soon for myeloma?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So I don't think that myeloma is going to stay incurable forever. I don't think that myeloma is incurable even today. I think that even today, we are curing a fraction of patients with myeloma. You can argue whether that's 10%, 15%, 20%. It's probably not more than 50%, but there is a fraction that we are already curing with the technologies that we're currently utilizing. And that doesn't even account for some of the newer technologies which are available in the relapse setting. It could be that when we bring that to earlier lines of therapy, we could theoretically cure more. The problem is that you don't know that somebody has been cured until you look back after they've been on treatment or off treatment and in remission for a very, very long time. So that is one of the problems that we don't know. Now, remission means very different things to very different people. So remission is a tricky word to grasp. Remission basically means that with the test that you're currently using, you're not seeing evidence of disease. So if you're using a blood test and you're not seeing, let's say, a monoclonal protein, or your light chains, the proteins made by the myeloma are normal, you could be a remission in the blood, meaning that you don't have any evidence of disease based on this test that you're looking. But it could be that if you use a test that has more sensitivity, more ability to detect cancer cells, you may not be in a remission based on that test, right? So the remission exists on a gradient, or one way to think about it is there's an iceberg, right? So there's always a little bit of the iceberg that you cannot see. So that remission means no evidence of disease with the test that you're currently utilizing. Cure means that the cancer is completely gone, you're off treatment, there's no likelihood that it's coming back. And that is something that historically has been tough to achieve in myeloma. We might be doing it, but we just wouldn't know for a while.
Thank you. I look to Jack and Thomas for my inspiration on how to get those long. I guess Thomas is still under active treatment, but I look to them for these long remissions. That will be awesome someday if we can all achieve that. So I had
our hope is,
go ahead.
Our hope is that we have more patients like that, right? Because the era has changed a lot, right? From when Jack and Thomas got their treatment, we have much better treatments. Like, it's inspiring hearing their stories, but we don't put people through as many transplants nowadays as Thomas went through. I heard his part. So that's a step in the right direction, right? Because it's tough, all of those treatments, and I'm glad that we're moving towards hopefully safer treatments with better quality of life. Still have a lot of work to do, but we're headed in the right direction.
Great, thank you. So I have two questions about something called translocation 1114, which is a mutation that may be seen on the myeloma cells. And correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe in 15 to 20% of patients with myeloma. So yes. I'm going to group these two questions together. One of them is, do all translocation 1114 develop into myeloma? And then is it harder for 1114 to get into MRD negative status?
So those are great questions. So 1114 translocation, as was pointed out, happens about 15 to 20% of patients with myeloma. It is not considered a high risk feature. It just is different. These are cancer cells that under the microscope look a little different than the regular myeloma cells, and they have some other genetic features and some specific mechanisms by which the cells divide that are a little different than the average myeloma, which allows them to be susceptible to a class of drugs that is fairly unique for this type of myeloma and isn't used for other types of myeloma. So it is not a bad prognostic thing. And if anything, it opens up another line of therapy that may not be used for other classes of myeloma. Now, one thing to note is that a subset, so not all patients with 1114, but a subset of 1114 does respond slower to treatment. And that is not, again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's very often that I have patients with 1114. I give them treatment. So the first 4 months of induction treatment, and they do really well. They feel better. Their pain is resolved. But when I do a bone marrow biopsy, or if I do the blood work, they still have a decent amount of cancer left, right? Like the M protein might have gone down just by 60% from where it started, and the bone marrow biopsy might still have 15, 20% cancer cells. If this is happening in somebody with 1114 myeloma with no other high-risk features, this is not a bad sign. It just means, how I explain it to patients is that these cancer cells are slower to grow, and hence they're also perhaps slower to treat, right? There's some really aggressive cancers that you give chemo and the cancer burden goes down very quickly. So it's just slower to grow, slower to respond. And sometimes you just have this pattern where it takes a long time to achieve a deeper response. And there's a fraction of patients with 1114 that never, even with good therapy, they never achieve a really, really deep response, meaning that the bone marrow is completely clear of cancer, what we call MRD negativity. And these patients still have really good long-term outcomes. So with 1114, there are all of these unique caveats to consider. And not all, so if you have MGUS, monoclonal gammopathy of underimage significance, or if you have smoldering myeloma, having 1114 does not mean you're going to become myeloma, because that was one part of the question that was asked. So not all people with who have 11-14 and a myeloma precursor condition are going to become myeloma. Having 11-14 does not increase the likelihood of becoming myeloma compared to those who don't have 11-14.
Great, thank you for that. That's a great explanation. Do you have time for one more general question, Dr. Manni?
Definitely,
Okay,
I do.
so this came through. I'll do a general one and then maybe one more if you have time on the live.
Of course.
So there was a patient asking about food groups that should be avoided or reduced during treatment, or maybe even foods that may or may not help during treatment or during a clinical trial. Do you have any comments about that?
Yes. So this is a very hot topic and people have strong opinions about it. So I'll start with one disclaimer that in general, eating healthy is a good thing, right? And that's what our grandma told us. We don't, that's not what the newest fanciest research has told us. We all know that, eating more fruits, more vegetables, and, cutting back on excessive carbs and keeping an eye on calories, these are all good things overall. The data has shown that eating a particular diet does not generally change cancer outcomes. Now, we don't have high quality data for myeloma because myeloma, all things considered, is a rare malignancy. But we have data from thousands of patients from who have had breast cancer or prostate cancer and some other common cancers, and eating specific diets, whether that's a calorie reduction or eating more vegetables or eating less fat, none of these diets have shown any change in cancer outcomes per se. So my take to this is, just like I would tell anybody else who doesn't have cancer, it's good to eat healthy, but I don't think that eating one particular type is going to make any impact whatsoever on the efficacy of your treatment or the overall cancer outcomes. So if it is empowering to you to change your diet, then I fully support it. If it is empowering to you to have the freedom to eat whatever you want, I support that as well, right? So I will meet you where you're at. I just don't think the data is strong enough, or I think the data pretty strongly actually suggests that eating a particular diet won't change cancer outcomes. It will change other things. There are always good benefits. So that's a discussion that I have with patients. Some people are empowered by the freedom of being able to eat whatever they want, not feeling guilty about eating ice cream. And some people feel empowered to use this diagnosis as an opportunity for healthier eating habits, which is a good thing. It may not change cancer outcomes, but it's a good thing overall because our patients with myeloma are living a long time, right? We want to keep them alive, and we also don't want them to die of heart problems or a stroke or something else down the road. So those are my thoughts on diet.
Thank you for that. That makes me feel a little bit better because a little piece of dark chocolate every other evening really helps my quality of life. So
go for it. You have my blessing.
Thank you. And then Dr. Manni, if you have to jump off, that's fine. I want to ask both Thomas and Jack if they have done anything from from eating differently or any type of physical or emotional health perspective, what you've done in your lives to improve your quality of life and just to do as well as you're doing.
I really, really love that answer Dr. Mohyuddin gave because that's what I tell everybody. I don't want people to feel guilty about their disease or feel guilty about eating, because they want something. I don't want them to mess with their quality of life because they want pizza and, oh, pizza is not good for me. It's like, no, eat it. If you want to eat it. It's like I don't change my diet. Let me rephrase that. I change my diet for me, right? Because I want to feel a certain way, or I want to look a certain way. I have hereditary family members that has high blood pressure and diabetes. So I eat so that I don't get those type things. But when it comes to the myeloma, no, if I still want something, I just eat it. So, and then I'm also in the gym too. So I'm always working out to help get it off me.
How about you, Jack?
Oh, I'll let you ask Dr. Manni that last question before he has to leave.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that real quickly. So, so there is a question about eligibility for clinical trials for non-secretory myeloma. Do you know of any clinical trials that would allow for the non-secretory myeloma folks out there who may want to participate in one? Thanks.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I'm writing a paper about this right now. This phenomena where patients with non-secretory disease are excluded from trials is a bigger problem in phase 3 studies. So in large phase 3 studies that are aimed to bring a drug to market, there's a lot of regulations involved, and the drug companies are very conservative, and they will often exclude patients with non-secretory disease. If you're looking at phase 1 trials, and not all phase 3s are like that, but you're more likely to have phase 3s that exclude non-secretory disease. I do think that most, at least at our institution, all of our investigator-initiated trials that are looking at newer drugs or newer mechanisms of supportive care, we do not exclude non-secretory disease. So you would have much better luck with an early phase trial, and there are quite a few that would allow you, but you'd be more likely to be excluded from a large registrational phase 3. So I think of the large registrational phase 3s that we've had for myeloma at our institution, and they've generally excluded non-secretory disease. Like we had one for cilta-cel at earlier lines of therapy, and that excluded. Then we had one for teclistamab from line 1 to line 4, that also excluded. And then we currently are going to have one for telcitamab, again, in earlier line of therapy, and that also is excluding. And that's, it's a problem, and I think that we have to address it, and we hope to change this in the future. We're going to draw attention because there's no reason why non-secretory patients should be excluded from these promising options. So yeah, those are my 2 cents on this.
Thank you very much. Time for one more question, Dr. Manni, or
Of
no?
course,
Do you need to
of
get?
course.
Okay.
No,
So you had mentioned about lines of therapy, and that is another, I don't want to say exclusionary factor, but say if a patient comes in, was diagnosed more recently, had one line of therapy, maybe with DKRD, but you have another patient who possibly had VRD and then tried KD upon first relapse. Now they're maybe eligible because they've had 2 lines of therapy with the same drugs, but the first patient only had 1 line of therapy because they got them all at once. So if a trial is enrolling only people who've had at least 2 lines of therapy, it might exclude some of those people if they've all had the same exact drugs, but just at different times. Do you think the trials will change to look at specific drugs used and refractoriness to those drugs versus how many lines of therapy? Does that make sense?
Yes, we wrote an entire paper just about this specific question, and we actually looked at currently enrolling myeloma trials, specifically CAR-T and bispecific trials, and we looked at whether they were focusing on lines of therapy or on the types of therapy already received, because you brought up 2 very unique situations. One patient has received just 1 line of therapy, but they got a lot of really active drugs, right? And whereas another patient got 1 line of therapy with some drugs and then another line of therapy. Eventually, they both have been exposed to the different classes of drugs, but the way they got there was very different. So what we found is that unfortunately, close to half of the trials that we were looking at had these arbitrary, requirements of lines of therapy, meaning that the first patient you described would not be eligible for this, even though in reality, like this is a patient population who needs those options. So I know that this is very high on the priority list of myeloma societies. A big part of when we met with the FDA last year, so there was a meeting with the FDA and the International Myeloma Society. One of the biggest things that the Myeloma Society was advocating for is, hey, let's loosen these requirements on these trials. Let's focus on class refractoriness or class exposure and not on lines of therapy. I don't think we've seen any substantial change yet, but this is a top focus for our community, and we're hopeful that this will change in the future, even if it hasn't changed just yet.
Thank you. That explains it really well. We appreciate that. I'm going to do one more question. It's something that comes up. So a lot of patients ask about neuropathy, how to deal with neuropathy, and it happens often. And even some patients have said drugs that don't typically have neuropathy, they're finding they have neuropathy. I'm one of those. I was on a continuous medication and developed neuropathy, I think, from that. So any suggestions? We'll start with Dr. Manni also on this one, but how to manage neuropathy, and at what point should a patient say, I can't handle this anymore? I know some patients minimize that. So I guess we have to always be telling our doctor, about our oncologist, I have neuropathy, but at what point should therapy stop because of that?
So this is a really good point, and I think that unfortunately, because in the past the myeloma drugs that we used to use were thalidomide, which thankfully we don't use a whole lot anymore, and we used a lot of bortezomib or Velcade. And in the past, we used to give Velcade twice a week, and we didn't have a lot of alternatives. So we used to keep on giving Velcade when patients would start developing neuropathy. So neuropathy with Velcade, which is the most common culprit, it's not the only medication, there are a few others, but Velcade is the most common culprit, usually starts very insidiously, and like it'll be like, this occasional numbness and tingling, and then it'll get more frequent, and then it'll become, all the time, and then it'll get to a point where the numbness, tingling, and the pain, like it prevents you from being able to do simple things like close your button or do your tasks. And then it could get to a point where it affects your balance and your blood pressure. So it is on a spectrum, and usually, although not always, but usually starts off pretty slow. I am extremely proactive. My opinion is that in the era where we have so many good myeloma drugs, there is no reason to keep pushing Velcade when neuropathy starts. So I stop Velcade at the beginning of when neuropathy develops, even though if you look at the guidelines, and the guidelines are from an era where, we used to have to push Velcade. But if you look at the guidelines, they'd be like, you can continue at grade 1, stop at what's called grade 2, where the pain is more, and it's beginning to affect your ability to do things. So the most important thing for us myeloma doctors to know, and for you, if you don't have neuropathy yet and you're on something like Velcade, the moment it starts, let your doctor know, because generally speaking, most of the times there are good alternatives, and we don't have to keep giving Velcade. That's the most important thing. Now, if neuropathy has already developed, I think that all of the treatments leave a little bit to be desired. So there's no perfect treatment. And I think this is a big shortcoming, and is an area of more research. Medications like gabapentin, which is Neurontin, or pregabalin can be used. You got to be careful with dizziness, sedation, sometimes a slight drop in the blood pressure, but that's usually where we start, gabapentin and pregabalin. Now, we have variable success with them. For some people, it works really well. For some people, it doesn't. But that's usually the first pharmacological therapy that we do. There are other classes of pharmacological drugs. So there's a drug called amitriptyline. There are topical patches. So there's a capsaicin patch or cream that you can use. There's a lidocaine patch that you can use. For some people, complementary or alternative things like acupuncture, like that has worked. So there's no one size fits all approach, and it's usually a method of trial and error and holding the culprit medication, and usually with Velcade, if you catch it early and you hold the medication, it does improve over time. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people today who got a lot of Velcade or thalidomide in the past, and they're left with lifelong neuropathy. I'd love to hear what Thomas and Jack have to say about this.
Yeah, Jack, do you have anything to add to that? Probably a lot, I suppose.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was one of those thalidomide trials where we took 800 milligrams a day. And I have a very bad case of neuropathy. I've tried all the meds that you mentioned, Dr. Manni, and as well as, alpha lipoic acid, things like that, as well as acupuncture. And I think your statement, not everything works for everyone, is certainly very fitting for me. So the best thing I've always heard is don't get it. That's the only way to really prevent it and cure it, if you will. So it can be very difficult to deal with, to the point where I typically get around via a mobility scooter these days, because it's, in my legs and prevents me from walking any kind of distance. So don't get it. And as
sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
You said, if you have any tingling, anything at all, notify the doctor as soon as possible, because treatments can be changed.
And I foresee a brighter future. I foresee that, the patients that we have attending today, who are newly diagnosed, 10, 20, 30 years out, I'm very optimistic that they're going to be alive and they're not going to have neuropathy. So I think things are getting better. Our newer class of drugs are better.
And the good thing about neuropathy is that any clinical trial result always measures neuropathy as a side effect. And so we are now aware of treatments that have a low potential or a higher potential of causing it. So that's the good thing, I think.
And I'm wondering, Dr. Manni, have you seen any patients not on Velcade, say on Revlimid, who have developed neuropathy? That I was not on Velcade, and my specialist says possible from the other medications I was on that typically don't cause neuropathy. That was what one of the other patients asked too, if that is possible.
Yes, absolutely. So with thalidomide, which is the older version, it was very common. With Revlimid, it is less common, but Revlimid can sometimes still cause neuropathy. So if you stop the Velcade and neuropathy is persisting, or there's something unusual, or sometimes people who are on Revlimid, like for maintenance, and Revlimid is the only drug they're on, they sometimes have neuropathy. So it is much more rare, but it can happen. I have totally seen it happen several times with Revlimid as well. And usually that also, if you catch it early, stop Revlimid, it'll get better.
Great.
Even the myeloma can cause neuropathy.
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. And then
Good to
sometimes
know.
the transplant, I've seen that also sometimes temporarily worsens pre-existing neuropathy. That's usually a temporary thing, and it does get better. But I've totally had patients where their neuropathy symptoms worsened in the weeks that followed the transplant.
Okay, good to know. Thank you so much to all of you for staying on. Thomas, did you have some final thoughts on that also?
Well, for my neuropathy, I utilize some vibration stuff. So I put some vibration things on the floor and just roll my foot over it and let the vibration kind of hit the nerves and help. It helps a little. The medication, like Jack and Dr. Rahman said, that you can go through the medication works for a while, but then it stops working. So we all find some way to cope with it.
Yep, that's true, or live with it, I suppose. Yeah. Thank you to all of you so much. I know I've kept you over already by about 15 minutes, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. For those of you who didn't have your questions answered on this program, we are going to try to maybe include that in another program sometime or to get back to you. So thank you so much to Dr. Manni, to Jack, and to Thomas for all of your expertise and sharing your experiences. We appreciate that so much. And thank you to all of you watching at home. We appreciate you joining us, and we hope you have a good week. Thank you.
Thank you.